Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome to the Deep Dark. I'm just kidding. This is a set that I built, actually. I have been spending a bunch of time today on my live stream figuring out some of the elements of the Deep Dark's ancient cities that we saw this weekend at Minecraft Live, because my brain was kind of set alight by all of the stuff we saw about the expanded vision for the Deep Dark, and so thanks to a texture pack that I got from Planet Minecraft, I will link that in the description down below, I have arranged a few blocks in the right order, and we have something that approximates the vision that we saw of the Deep Dark. You'll take a look at this scene here. It might look a little bit different in the video, but if we sweep our eyes up in this direction, you might notice, yeah, it looks kind of similar. It looks maybe from a different angle, it might look kind of similar to the video that we saw at Minecraft Live this week, where King B-Dogs and the team rolled out the vision for the expansion of the Deep Dark that is coming in Minecraft 1.19, the Wild update. And this resource pack just retextures black glazed terracotta into some of the regular Sculk blocks. We have purple terracotta masquerading as the Skulk catalyst, and the Skulk growth is just replaced by glow lichen, which is why some of these areas look a little bit glowier than they might do otherwise, and you'll see little patches of glow lichen out there on the walls. It also contains a Skulk trap, which I think is in here somewhere, replacing one of the other glazed terracotta blocks. I don't believe this block is actually in the game anymore. It was just loosely based on something that we saw early and that, you know, people had dug out of textures in the code or something like that. But I think for now, we don't need to worry too much about the Skulk trap. So I'm going to clear out the rest of my inventory. Skulk sensors are, of course, in the game already, just under a /give command, and we won't really be seeing those much until 1.19, it looks like, but you can still dig these things out of creative and mess around with them if you want to. The other stuff we saw, I'm actually going to be going through in this video because I'm really excited about some of the elements of the Deep Dark in the video, and I honestly want to share some of this stuff with you. It's kind of like here are some things you might have missed about the Deep Dark video, except you probably did catch some of this stuff, so I'm not going to, talk down to you and say that you missed all of this stuff, but I do want to share some of my thoughts on it, because there are some details of this that are frankly really, really awesome. Now, first of all, the ancient cities of the Deep Dark are really big, and it seems like kind of a silly thing to say, really. Like, of course they're really big, but if you look at the deep slate caves that generated in this world, if you look at some of the ones that are around here, they're all kind of narrow and small. It is actually quite rare that you stumble into a cavern that is this large, and it took me probably a good 10 to 15 minutes of flying around in this world before I stumbled on this one, and a significant amount of that was lava lakes, but there were some sections large enough that I decided to build out what I saw from the Deep Dark ancient city this weekend and decided to reproduce some of it in this form. Considering that the Deep Dark is supposed to be both deep and also dark, it's unlikely that you'll find them generating near any lava lakes, from which we can draw a couple of conclusions. First of all, these ancient cities are potentially only going to be spawning when there are large enough areas underground that, hopefully, do not have close enough proximity to any of these lava lakes. And there's a couple of other reasons why this is going to be important, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the other conclusion we could draw for this is that maybe the ancient cities will kind of carve out a space for themselves. If there isn't a cavern, then the structure generation might just make one, and that might actually be a sensible way for these to generate in places that we otherwise would not have explored down here at the deepest levels of the world. Now, the second things I wanted to cover have to do with block composition. We're looking at deep slate. There's a bit of basalt around. There's both smooth and polished basalt. There is Skulk everywhere, and there are these mysterious wood blocks. Prowl8413 and a couple of folks from his community pointed this out to me on Twitter, that there are wood blocks down here. I mean, we figured deep slate was going to feature heavily in the Deep Dark, and the ruins are obviously made out of deep slate variants. There's, a bunch of bricks and polished deep slate and even deep slate tile used quite liberally. It's also the place where we're going to find a lot of the chiseled deep slate that kind of resembles the Warden's face quite loosely, so we're going to be seeing a lot of that down here, and it makes sense that whoever built these ruins had some kind of knowledge of the Warden. Again, more on that in a second, but Prowl and a bunch of people from his community did notice that there were occasional wood blocks in there, and we're not certain if those have been filled in by the player in this kind of playtest session that King B-Dogs was doing for the purposes of recording the video, or if the wood actually generates down here naturally. And I wasn't able to incorporate it into any of the architectural features in my little mock-up here because I'm not sure what role the wood plays. But if there is wood naturally generating in the Deep Dark, then that kind of means a couple of things. First of all, it tells you that the people who built down here have clearly been to the surface. It's like, from a lore perspective here, maybe they've been to the surface and decided to bring some supplies down so they could set up this giant city, and they've got some wood down here already. Obviously, they've left chests and stuff, so it makes sense that they had some wood with them at the time. Alternatively, they might have found an abandoned mineshaft down here in the lower levels of the world and stolen wood from that, which honestly might be an even cooler backstory for these cultists who have apparently built this shrine to the Warden. While we're at it, we also see these wall designs looking like a giant open mouth, kind of much like the mouth of the Warden, and I've had trouble reproducing these accurately because what is this block? What the heck is this block? It's certainly not like anything we have seen before. I believe it's been mentioned here and there on a couple of streams with the developers, but I am entirely not sure what this block is, and it's kind of interesting because it looks like a fence pattern, but it's clearly a block with 3D, like cubic geometry. It's got a really interesting texture, and as it's laid out across the top and the bottom, it kind of looks like arrows or chains or something like that, but there is clearly something connecting all of them. Is this a block that's made with the chain items that we can get? Is it like a deep slate chain block, or is there something else going on? And what is the significance of it being arranged in this sort of like widescreen portal formation? Is that just meant to look like the Warden's mouth, like the concept art that we've seen shared on Twitter by Mariana Salimena, or is this something else that we just don't know about yet? Whatever it is, absolutely terrifying. This next point is not going to stray far from the block composition of the area, but I think it's a really interesting point, and that is that the player in the video walks on paths made of wool. And these look like they are using light grey wool for the most part, although dark grey wool does feature in some of the other areas of the ruins, but there are these light grey wool paths that stretch around the walkways of this ruin, and that's going to feel significant to anyone who's been playing with the Skulk sensor in the 1.17 and 1.18 snapshots, because wool occludes sound. You can walk on wool, and Skulk sensors will not detect your footsteps unless you walk directly over them. And right now, that doesn't include sneaking, but I believe that has been changed in the video, according to King B-Dogs, where Skulk sensors will detect you if you sneak directly over them now. You can block them from sensing you by placing wool in front of them, or even in front of yourself, as long as the Skulk sensor doesn't have, like, line of sight to you, or, you know, however you would really describe that. Line of hearing, I suppose. And you've got to expect that since it's based on a similar system, the Warden and the new Skulk Shriekers could be avoided the same way, although the Warden has other ways of sensing you, which we'll get back to a little bit later on. Back to the wool, though. This is not just a block choice for texture, this is both a hint to the player and some very cool environmental storytelling. While exploring the Deep Dark, if you're unfamiliar with the mechanics already, you might notice that walking on wool doesn't trip the alarm system, and this teaches players to use wool in this way, and also, if you think about it, provides a decent supply of wool you can harvest from the environment, just in case you didn't think to bring any with you. It also suggests that the previous residents of this underground ruin knew about the sensitive hearing of the Warden and the Skulk sensors and were prepared for them, or maybe put the wool here as a countermeasure. Either that, or they just wanted to keep their feet warm when they took off their shoes in the Deep Dark, but I'm guessing it's the former. Next up, because they are pretty much everywhere in the video, let's talk about the candles. And also the skulls. Candles made an appearance in the Warden's segment in Minecraft Live 2020, which was really more a teaser for candles, since those hadn't really been formally announced anywhere, but it seems like those have been included heavily in the Deep Dark's ancient cities, and it's not really for lighting, because we know from comments King B-Dogs has made elsewhere, and it's pretty much confirmed in the video, that mobs won't spawn in the Deep Dark. They risk setting off the Warden before the player even gets there. There is a section that I'll talk about a little bit later, with the mobs getting killed to expand the Skulk, but that's kind of a different mechanic. We'll touch on that in a second. From the fact that they don't want to get mobs in here tripping the alarm system, you kind of expect that there would be some way to prevent mobs from coming into the Deep Dark biome. Maybe like hoglins and warped fungus, they kind of get scared of it and turn away, but it seems like at least the Deep Dark biome itself is going to be a non-spawnable area, kind of like a mushroom biome. But the candles all seem to be here for atmosphere, which is obviously really important to a horror experience. Now, I had a look and I couldn't find out who pointed this out to me. I think it was somebody in the Twitch chat while we were covering Minecraft Live with the Spawn Chunks podcast, and we noticed that there is a skull on this block behind the stairs. This is during the segment of the video where the player is trying to escape the Warden once it spawns in. We can pause it right there, and you'll notice big old skull right there, skeleton skull. And this might just be for the atmosphere of the video. We don't know how much of this is going to be like final generation of ancient cities, but mob heads don't typically get used for decoration like this. You don't find them anywhere else in the world, along with the fact that the skeleton skull could only be obtained in survival by a player killing a skeleton using a charged creeper. So that's actually a pretty cool touch, along with the horror vibe, if you imagine it being the skull of a player. Potentially, you could go to the Deep Dark for mob heads without having to get the charged creeper method involved. Now, while we're hanging out in this area, the area that I sort of mocked up a little bit of after seeing the video of the player being chased by the Warden, I want to point out that the Warden now comes out of the floor. Now, this is one of the most obvious things in the video. It's kind of the reason the video exists, but it is a big deal. No other mob really spawns like this. It's like the only mob that really has like a spawning animation, unless you count stuff like the Ender Dragon and the Wither. And while we don't get a close look at it, the animation that we can see is superb. We're going to go like a little bit slower so that you can kind of see it rising up before the darkness overwhelms the player. The noise is creepy, it's organic but very unnatural feeling at the same time. It's kind of slimy, and it rises out of a thick area of the Skulk, which kind of makes me wonder if a certain amount of Skulk coverage is going to be required for the Warden to spawn, or if it might manifest that amount of Skulk when it appears, or if it can just appear out of nowhere. It also makes me wonder if it's possible to spawn one anywhere outside of the Deep Dark. My guess would be no, but the possibilities are pretty creepy. Now, over here we have my next point. There is soul fire in the Deep Dark, and for the purposes of the video, it's on soul sand. We don't know if the Skulk itself is going to eventually burn blue, but it looked like there was soul sand or maybe soul soil in a few different places in the Deep Dark. You also notice it in this area leading up to this kind of altar with the candles and the portal. In the background, there's just the blue of a section of the world that hasn't loaded in, or perhaps a big waterfall or something like that, but you see the flicker of some blue soul fire behind there, and that's what gives off some of the blue particles that the player sees as you're walking up to this. Naturally, this fits with the blue aesthetic of Skulk Blocks really well, and it also kind of implies a connection to the Nether. You see soul lanterns being used fairly deliberately here as well. The other side of this is that soul fire and soul lanterns burn with a lower light than regular lanterns and fire do, so you can end up getting a bit of atmosphere in the place by using these soul lanterns, because I think they only produce like a light level of around 10 or 11 as opposed to a 14 or 15 from the soul torch and lantern respectively. The other thing to know about the fire is that it gives off a constant ambient crackling noise. We can hear that when we get close to the fire. You can also see it in the subtitles. Candles that are lit in the area and crackling are probably also going to produce the same effect. And you get the sense that if that was a constant ambient noise, it might distract the Warden. But no, it doesn't seem to do that in the video at all, meaning that it's very deliberately player noises or mob noises in the area which are going to distract the Warden. Sounds like the crackling of a fire or even like a furnace smelting probably won't bother the Warden when it's in pursuit of a player. Another neat thing we saw is that the chests in the Deep Dark have some countermeasures in them too. They are talking about adding unique loot to the Deep Dark. I'm not certain what the loot is going to be, of course, but we saw them grabbing a couple of enchanted books. That's nothing too special, but they also had snowballs in the chests and a little bit of string. Not sure what the string could be used for, maybe a tripwire if you're planning on trapping the Warden, but the snowballs were very definitely to throw at objects so that the Warden could detect the impact of the snowball and be distracted by it. Now, it's a little bit harder to do with Skulk sensors around because they will detect the player throwing it like that one just did, but say, for example, we're a little bit further away, we throw the snowball, the sound of the impact is what triggers the Skulk sensor, so the Warden is potentially going to be looking for something that happened over here instead of the player who threw it. It won't work so well at close range if it works like the Skulk sensors do, because this one clearly detects me throwing before it detects the impact of the snowball over there. So just like the wool blocks, the chest loot here gives the player a hint at how they can distract or avoid the Warden. We even saw the snowballs being used as an example back in Minecraft Live 2020 when the Warden was first announced. So whoever left this loot here knew that the Warden would come and has left snowballs here as a countermeasure. Once again, the implications for the lore of that are that whoever built these ruins knew a lot about the Warden and how it worked. Now, this next section is sadly something that I can't show you from my little test world here in the snapshot because I don't have access to the texture or the block model for a Skulk Shrieker. I expect people are working hard on remodeling that just for the sake of modding it into the game to see how some of this stuff works ahead of time, but I'm just going to have to rely on the evidence of the video for this one. And while the Skulk Shrieker is a really cool block, and the devs talked about, being able to pick it up and take it with you and create this like alarm system for your base with it if you wanted to, it does seem to be the trigger mechanism by which the Warden is summoned. Now, blindness has been in the game for a while. It allows you to only see in a small radius around the player, but the Skulk Shrieker infects a new status effect called Darkness. The name might be temporary, but that's responsible for this pulsing wave of shadow that surrounds the player. It feels very different to the sudden effect of blindness, which you can only get through Suspicious Stew in survival, but it's really helpful to the horror atmosphere that this wave of darkness kind of rolls in. And the fact that it pulses in and out instead of being a constant blindness effect like this actually means that you can still see a little bit further and plan your escape route if the Warden is closing in on you. There is, of course, no word yet on whether or not this status effect is curable with milk, but obviously the Warden might be able to hear you drinking the milk, which might be kind of a dead giveaway. And it's possible that the effect is kind of a compound one where activating another Skulk Shrieker while you already have this darkness status effect is what summons the Warden, similar to how walking into a village with Bad Omen can start a raid. There may even be multiple levels of darkness that you accrue by walking too close to the Skulk Shriekers and setting them off, so potentially you end up with Darkness 3, and then on the 4th scream, that's what summons the Warden once you have enough of the effect stacked up. But the mechanics of the Warden aside, a new status effect also means it potentially needs to be included in the How Did We Get Here advancement, so have fun uprooting a Skulk Shrieker when you want to claim that advancement now. Before we get too far away from the Warden, because of course it is kind of the star of the show here in the Deep Dark, the Warden can two-shot you in full netherite armor. The player in the video is wearing full unenchanted netherite. The enchantments might make a big difference if you have protection 4 or whatever, but netherite's armor toughness should already be reducing the amount of damage a really heavy swing can do. Yet the Warden's first hit does 13 points of damage to a fully armored player. That is 6.5 hearts of damage, and presuming they're playing on hard difficulty, that is twice as much as a Ravager, and about the same, maybe like even a little bit more powerful than an Iron Golem can hit you. Without armor on hard difficulty, a Ravager, using the Ravager as the example here, can do 18 points of damage, or 9 hearts. So assuming the Warden is doing twice that, assuming it's a linear damage curve, it is doing 18 hearts worth of damage in one hit. That is massive overkill, and it makes the Warden very, very scary, even to heavily armored players. Add to that the fact that in testing, Keen B-Dogs has confirmed the Warden could have potentially 500 health or more, really stacks the deck against the player. And you're thinking about maybe there are ways to cheese the Warden. Nope, he's thought of that. There are going to be ways that the Warden will be able to prevent you from just pillaring up and filling it full of arrows. There are going to be ways to take it down if you are smart enough or have the right strategy, and I'm sure those strategies will circulate once the Warden is actually released in a snapshot or whatever, but those are things that the developers could even program workarounds for once players get used to the same mechanics. Once again, it's worth emphasizing, and the game itself is trying to prove to the player through environmental storytelling and some of the stuff like the wool paths and everything around here, that the Warden is something to be avoided rather than to be openly fought one-on-one. And finally, let's touch on the Skulk catalysts, because those are really interesting. They are naturally, as the name suggests, the thing that causes the Skulk to spread, and it is possible to silk touch them, take them out of the Deep Dark, and spread them elsewhere, as you see in the example of the cave environment that they move to in order to test this out. The player kills a couple of zombies around the Skulk catalyst, and we see a few soul particles, kind of similar to the ones used in the Soul Speed enchantment, appear over the top of the catalyst block, along with this kind of pulsing animation. Now, I'm fairly certain this does not take place in the Deep Dark because there are mobs here, and as we've mentioned before, mobs wandering around in the Deep Dark kind of defeats the point of it being a stealth area, so we can presume that the player has moved to a different part of the cave for this demonstration. You see similar soul shapes in the center of the Warden's chest, which has a lot of implications about what the Warden does, and we don't really know if harvesting souls if we can presume that's what these are, makes the Warden more powerful or whatever. But the Skulk catalysts seem to translate this into the growth of the Skulk around them. And Agnes and King B-Dogs even hinted at the fact that this is going to be tied into XP somehow. You get XP from breaking the blocks, and the amount of Skulk spread depends on the XP that would be dropped by whatever it was you killed there. So in theory, if you plant some Skulk in the end, right when you kill the Ender Dragon, when it drops like 12,000 XP the first time around, you're going to cover the entire End Island in Skulk Blocks. That's going to be pretty impressive. But it also brings up the question of exactly how the Deep Dark ended up with this much Skulk growing around it, especially if mobs aren't going to spawn here naturally. We can assume that the only mobs that die in the vicinity of Skulk catalysts are going to be mobs that the player has brought in, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Say a zombie that follows you through from a cave into one of the ancient cities in the Deep Dark. And I have a feeling that this is meant to indicate there have been maybe sacrifices of some kind that were made here in the Deep Dark. Given the amount of candles and like altar-like areas around here, I have a sense that potentially the amount of Skulk here is due to some sort of offerings being made to the Warden, and whether or not that succeeded or failed remains to be seen. And that's most of what I wanted to cover, but I did notice a couple of other details here and there in the video, like, for example, the redstone lamps that you see occasionally dotted around in these pillars, most notably on the way up to this wall with the candles, and that had the kind of giant portal, the widescreen TV with the weird blocks around it. You'll notice that there are some redstone lamps embedded in the tops of the pillars here. And I think some people in Twitch chat might have suggested this one as well, but it was really interesting that the tops of these pillars were closed off without any kind of attachment to anything else. And what that could potentially mean was that a Skulk sensor might be hidden up here behind the polished deep slate stairs. That would mean that as soon as you walked off this wool path and got close enough, you'd be able to trigger the Skulk sensors in there, and they would illuminate the redstone lamps briefly. Obviously, the wool here is going to occlude that, and then once you step off, once you decide to walk around a little bit around here, you'll start to trigger those lamps. And once again, this could act as a little bit of a hint to the player, kind of teaching players that you need to watch where you're stepping here because you're triggering some stuff before you get into the central area where the Skulk Shriekers might be and the Warden could spawn. You need to watch where you're walking because the walls might be listening to you. But it could also potentially be a neat way of teaching players that the Skulk sensors, if you acquire them, can be used in combination with redstone components, and that activating them via sound outputs a redstone signal that can be used in a variety of contraptions. They are, as we've seen, player detectors, but also detect a whole variety of sound, and I think it'd be really cool if they put them in here to activate the redstone lamps on top of each of these pillars. And I'm pretty certain that's everything I wanted to cover from this video, but I'm sure you eagle-eyed folks out there might have found even more details that I have missed. So I'd be interested to hear from you if you've noticed anything about the video that seemed intriguing, seemed like new mechanics, new blocks, any of that stuff that you spotted in the background. Let me know, and we'll have to do an investigation into this in future, especially once we get slightly closer to having these things in a snapshot for 1.19. Obviously 1.18 has to come out first, but I am very excited to see the expanded vision for the Deep Dark in 1.19, the Wild update. I'm going to go and watch the announcement video again. Until then, folks, thank you so much for watching this episode. My name has been Pixlriffs. Please don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye for now.